Hello everyone and welcome to my channel where I discuss all of the 20 CSEC poems on a weekly basis. In this week's video, I analyze the poem Orchids by Hazel Simmons-McDonald. In other words, I employed line-by-line analysis of its stanzas, poetic devices, themes, tones, and moods, along with their individual effectiveness. So as usual, feel free to ask me any questions you may have about any aspects of the poem and share your insights as well in the comment section below. So without further ado, let's begin by reading the poem. Orchids by Hazel Simmons-McDonald. I leave this house. Box pieces of the 5-week life I've gathered. I'll send them on to fill spaces in my future life. One thing is left, a spray of orchids someone gave from a bouquet, one who makes a ritual of flower-giving scent. The orchids have no fragrance, but purple petals draw you to look at the purple hat. I watered them once, when the blooms were full-blown, like polished poems. I was sure they'll wilt and I would toss them out with the 5-week litter. They were stubborn. I starved them. They would not die. This morning, the bud at the stalk's tips unfold. I'll think I'll plot the full-blown blooms pressed between pages of memory. Perhaps in their thin, dry transparency, I'll discover their peculiar poetry. So let's begin the analysis of the poem with stanza 1. So stanza 1, we just have 2 lines. It says, I leave this house, box pieces of the 5-week life I've gathered. Okay? So the person is actually moving from one residence to another. In this case, the person is leaving a house and the person has placed his or her belongings in boxes, different boxes. And inside of these boxes, we will find the things that the person acquired over the 5 weeks he or she stayed at that house. Whether the things were acquired, they were bought, they were donated. The person wasn't specific to say how he or she acquired those items, but they were placed in boxes. Okay? Now, the box pieces is an example of visual imagery. Remember, I told you that imagery itself is a poetic device. Okay, so if you are identifying a poetic devices in any poem and you're using imagery, you must identify the type of imagery. So in this case, we have visual imagery, which is box pieces. Okay, because it allows the persona to visualize several boxes with items collected, packed there, ready to be transported to the persona's future address. Okay, and that's stanza 1. Now stanza 2 says, I'll send them on to fill spaces in my future life. So the box items will be sent to the persona's next resident. Okay, they will be a part of what constitutes the persona's home. Stanza 3. So all of those 2 stanzas, we just had 2 lines. Stanza 3 has 4. And it says, one thing is left, a spray of orchids someone gave. So the person is saying that after he or she, and I'm saying he or she because a gender was not identified in the poem. Sometimes students like to give gender to the persona when it is not there. If it is not stated, it is always safe to say the persona. Okay? So the persona shares with us that one thing is left. After placing the belongings inside of boxes, one thing is left. And what is left? A spray of orchids someone gave. Somebody gave the persona a spray, a bunch of orchids, right, from a bouquet. One who makes a ritual of flower-giving scent. So the person is saying basically that he or she has placed everything in boxes, but something has been left out. Something is there lingering. And we found out that what is lingering? A spray of orchids that was given from a bouquet by someone. Notice that someone makes a ritual of flower-giving scent. What the person is saying is that the person who gave him or her the spray of flowers is in the habit of giving gifts of flowers for no reason at all. And we all know that when you give somebody a gift to mark an occasion, that it's more sentimental. Persons tend to treasure or attach value or meaning to that gift, okay? But if you have to go and give somebody a gift because today's Monday, because tomorrow is Tuesday, or because today's the 5th or the 4th, without any special reason, of course, that person will not attach any value or tend to care about that item. So this is what's happening here with the persona, because there's somebody who gave the persona a spray of orchid, and that person is in the habit of just giving flowers, okay? So as it relates to poetic devices, we have an example of visual imagery, right? And the visual imagery there is the spray of orchids that is left there. Where it is left on the table, on the floor, that information was not given. But what we know is that the spray of orchids is unpackaged, is unboxed, right? It is just there. It is left there. It is left behind. So this visual imagery actually allows the reader to visualize the spray of orchids apart from the persona's boxed items. Okay, so that's our first poetic devices. Then we have diction. Diction is not a figurative device, but it is a poetic device. And usually, if you identify or you're using diction as a poetic device, you have to identify a word from the poem. And when you find that word, it is important that you give a definition for that word. And the word we're looking at here in stanza 3 is ritual. Right? The word ritual refers to a behavior or way of doing something regularly and in the same way. Right? So basically what we are learning here by the use of the word ritual is that because the person was in the habit of just giving flowers for no reason at all, the persona didn't form any attachment to that flowers. Right? That spray of flowers, which we will see later on in the poem as we discuss it stanza by stanza. Let's move on to stanza 4. So now stanza 4 says, the orchids have no fragrance, but purple petals draw you to look at the purple heart. Okay, so there are several poetic devices here, but let's go through the meaning of stanza 4 line by line, beginning with the first line which says, the orchids have no fragrance. So for the person to know that the orchids have no fragrance, it means that the person actually smells them. Usually when you see somebody who's gifted flowers, they tend to be smelling it and so on, right? Probably looking for the scent or to see what fragrance it consists of or it has. So in this case, the orchids have no fragrance. So I can tell that it was a turn off for the persona. But, right? But suggests that although the persona observes or realizes that the orchids have no fragrance, something saved it. What saved it? It's purple petals. The persona says, but purple petals draw you to look at its purple heart. Okay, now let's identify the different poetic devices here so they can enhance our interpretation of what's happening here in stanza 4. So we'll begin with olfactory imagery. So when we talk about olfactory imagery, this is an imagery that appeals to our sense of smell. Okay, and you get this a lot when you are looking at advertisement where they, for example, they are advertising a barbecue chicken on a grill where they will use words like succulent and so on. And then, believe it or not, it's as if you're actually smelling the actual chicken or the actual barbecue sauce. Okay, that's what we call olfactory imagery, when words are used to appeal to your sense of smell. So the example of olfactory imagery in stanza 4 is the word fragrance, right? It has no fragrance. You can smell when something has a fragrance, or you can smell when something doesn't, no? So in this case, the flower doesn't have it. And this tells us, or it allows us to understand why the persona did not form any attachment to the flowers. Besides the fact that the flowers were gifted for no reason at all, they had no fragrance. But one thing saved it. But the purple petals draw you in. Okay, so we also have there number 2, visual imagery. Purple petals is an example of visual imagery because it appeals to our sense of sight. Even though we are not looking at the physical flower, we are familiar with the word purple, and we would have seen petals, okay, that part of a flower. And it helps us to visualize the color of the petals and its dark purple center, which we will see in the third line in stanza 4, okay? Then we have what we call a pun. A pun is both, it's a figurative device and it's a poetic device. So a pun is the amusing use of words that have the same sound but different meaning. So literally, the orchid has, the petals are purple, right? But in the center of the orchid, you will find a darker purple hue of the petal, right in the center there. So that's what they're calling the heart. It's not that it actually has like a fleshly heart there, but because they're referring to its center, it's known as the purple heart, right? So let's talk about a pun as a literary or figurative device. So as a figurative device, when we talk about a pun, literally, a purple heart is a medal of honor given to soldiers who have demonstrated notable bravery during their service. And this is usually given to like those soldiers who fought a war. They would have lost a leg or arm or something that actually makes them or ended their time serving in the army. Okay, they're given like a badge of honor, right, as they are dismissed, right? It's called a purple hat. And notice that it is given when they would have demonstrated notable bravery during service. Okay, and this bravery is rewarded by, you know, the distribution of this medal. We will find out later why the person is attributing the quality of bravery, or even wanting to allude to that medal called the purple hat. Okay, it's as if it's saying that this particular orchid, this particular flower is deserving of a medal, right? The same medal that is given to soldiers who are retiring or who have been dismissed for one reason or the other in the army because they would have demonstrated bravery during service. Okay, so one, literally, the purple hat can be the center, that darker shade of purple, the center of the orchid, and it can also mean figuratively a medal of honor that is given to soldiers in the army as a reward for their bravery. There's also the use of alliteration. So alliteration occurs when we have the repetition of letters that are close. So in this case, the P is alliterated there in stanza 4, in purple, in the word purple, and in the word petal. Okay, so this accentuates or highlights the rich, vibrant purple hue of the orchids, you know, which actually helps us to understand why it captivated or why it captured the persona's attention, although this particular flower had no fragrance. Let's move on to stanza 5. So now stanza 5 says, I watered them once, when the blooms were full blown. Okay, so why is it that the person is sharing with us that he or she watered them once? We know for flowers to survive that at some point in their lives, because there are some plants, there are some flowers that need daily attention, watering and so on, and there's some that you can water once in a while, sometime over the course of 2 days, not 2 days, probably 2 weeks, 7 days or 3 weeks. You know, so there's some plants that can sustain themselves in that way, right? But the person is sharing here in the first line of stanza 1 that I watered them once. When the blooms were full blown, when they were healthy. And I'm certain you would have seen a flower, like a freshly picked flower, when the petals are all smooth and it's, you know, it's fresh, it's new, right? In comparison to that flower, we just put it down and by the end of the day, they will certainly not look the same. That's why when persons buy flowers or persons receive flowers, they tend to want to put them in water, okay, in order to preserve them a bit longer. But the person shares with us that he or she watered them once when the blooms were full blown, like polished poems. I was sure they will. So the person is saying that I was certain that they will. I was certain that they would die at one point, okay? And not just at one point. I was certain that after watering them once, they will die. They will be a part of the garbage that I will throw out at the end of the week. A person said that I was certain I would toss them out in the 5-week litter. 5-week litter tells us that the person, all of the garbage, all of the litter that the person would have acquired, because he or she is obviously moving from one resident to the other, that the flowers would be a part of that garbage as well. Those are the person who said that he or she was certain. Okay? So let's identify and examine the different poetic devices there in stanza 5 to enhance your understanding, to get you to understand what's really happening here in stanza 5. So let's begin with the alliteration. I told you in a previous, in stanza 4, that the P was alliterated, and likewise here in stanza 5. The P in polish and the P in poem, right? It's alliterated, it's repeated, and because it's repeated, it communicates the similarity between the orchids and poems. So basically, when the person says that I watered them once, when the blossoms were full blown like polished poems. Polished poems, there's an example from metaphor. When a poem is polished, it means that it is well crafted, it is well written, it's perfect. There's nothing more you can do for this poem or to this poem. It is just perfect as it is. So the person has likened the poems or polished poems to the blossoms of the orchids when he or she first received them, when they were watered once. Okay? Then of course we have the simile here. The blossoms, right? They are being compared to polished poems. We also have the metaphor, as I told you, like poems, the freshly blooms are perfect. These alliteration, the simile and the metaphor there, they're really used to get you to understand how perfect the orchids were when the person watered them once at the beginning. Okay? And of course, we have visual imagery. The visual imagery there in yellow, the blossoms when they were full blown. We can visualize a freshly picked flowers, even though it's not plucked. We know what a fresh flower looks like while it is still attached to its stem or tree or plant. Okay, so it helps us to see the petals are fully open and they are completely developed. And of course, we have examples of diction, right? The word polished means shiny and refined. So by using the word polished, we know that the person is trying to convey to us that the petals were shiny, they were well defined, they were fully developed. And of course, the word full-blown means completely developed, okay? These are all to give us a visual representation of what the orchids looks like at the beginning when the person received them. Let's move on to stanza 6. So stanza 6 says, they were stubborn, I starved them, they will not die. Now notice that the person for some reason is calling or denoting the quality of stubbornness to a flower. So right away we know that this is an example of personification. Personification occurs when we give human attributes or qualities to inanimate object or non-human objects. Okay, so in this case the person is saying that the plant was stubborn. They were stubborn because obviously it appears that the orchids is being resilient. Right? Resilient. The orchids are refusing to do what the person wants. Right? The person really expected the orchid to die at a certain point. So that's why the person is referring to them as stubborn. Notice that the person, besides calling them stubborn, actually said, I starved them. It tells us that the person deliberately wanted these orchids or the flowers to die. I starved them suggests that the person withheld water and even the possible sunshine and all that the plant needed in order to actually bloom, in order to survive. And the person says they will not die. Right? So the use of the personification there highlights the orchid's resilience to remain alive. And it emphasizes why the orchids deserve this same Purple Heart, which is a medal of honor. Remember that poem we discussed in stanza 4 or 3? Right, about the Purple Heart and it being given to soldiers in the army as a means of demonstrating bravery. Right, so basically that's what the poet wants us to get. The poet wants to attach the quality of bravery to the orchid, which suggests that amidst life challenges, amidst what persons throw at you, amidst the challenges, the different hurdles, when persons expect you to fall down, to lose, to not get to the finish line, amidst the different challenges, you survive. This is really a beautiful message here, right? And of course, the word diction can be used as a poetic device, using the word stubborn, even the word starve. Starve, when you try to starve somebody or someone, that is really a powerful word, to starve someone suggests that it's very deliberate, right? You really want to see a particular outcome. Right? So stubbornness illustrates the orchid's refusal to die in spite of being starved. Right? This shows the orchid's resilience, courage, and strength. Stanza 7 says, this morning, the bud at the stalk's tipped unfurled. Right? This is completely different because let's remember that the persona was certain that by the time I'm ready to move out of this place, to move from one home to the other, that this orchid, this flower that was given to me by that person, that compulsive person, would die. It will be a part of the garbage. Okay, however, by saying that this morning the bud at the stalks tipped unfurled, it suggests that the flowers actually got in a state where it had wilt, where the petals were looking crepey, they were looking, as if the flowers itself had died. Right? So maybe the person thought, yes, I was winning. And just when the devil or just when your enemy think that they got you, what? God redeems you. Right? The Bible says that that God will always prepare a table before you in the presence of your enemy. When Satan thinks that he got you, that you're at the point of death where there's no turning back, a miracle happens. This is what's happening here. Notice that I have a little picture here, just to show you just a bit illustration of what happened that morning. Just when the person think, okay, yes, let me pick you up and show you in the garbage, the bud at the stalk's tipped just unfurled, just opened up. Okay, so let's examine the different poetic devices there to just enhance your understanding as usual. Now the word morning. When you hear the word morning, it suggests newness. It suggests revitalization or new beginnings. Okay, the use of the morning, that's basically what it usually means. Sometimes you hear there's a hymn called "Morning Has Broken," or sometimes you hear when the night has passed, morning will come. Morning is always a word that gives you hope, a new beginning, starting over again. Okay, and for the petals, it suggests, or the orchid, that this is what was happening to it. It was a new morning. It was so new that it was revitalized. Notice that the stalks tipped, unfurled. The word unfurled, I mean it opened up into a flower, which we're seeing demonstrating here in that beautiful image there on my left. Right? So the symbolism is used to convey the idea of newness, revitalization, new hope. Right? So morning suggests hope, new beginning for the orchids as the petal opens up into a fresh flower. And of course, we have imagery, visual imagery, because it appeals to a sense of sight. The fact that something opens up and unfurls, you need your eyesight. You know, it appeals to your sense of sight. Okay? And of course, I'm giving you a little aid there, not that it's in the poem, just to help you understanding a bit. So the reader visualizes the wilt flower, the flower being in a state of almost death, all gloopy and bending down, just one day. That particular morning just opened up as if it's a fresh, not as if, into a fresh flower. Stanza 8 reads, I think I'll plot the full-blown blooms pressed between pages of memory. So after witnessing what transpired there with the flower, after reflecting and thinking deeply about wait, when I got this flower, I wasn't attached, I was disinterested. Because one, it was given to me for no reason at all. There's no sentiment attached to it. I was sure I was going to kill it. You know, I even watered it once. I even starved it. I was sure it would have been a part of the garbage. You know, but this morning it just opened up just like that. I am so surprised. Wait, there's really something here about this particular orchid, this particular flowers. So after thinking and considering all that had transpired, the person says what? I think I'll pluck the full-blown blooms. I think, you know what? I will pluck one of these petals, you know, and I will press them. I will put them between pages of memory. Now, there's this habit of there's some persons who, especially persons who love flowers and unnecessary flowers, there's some persons who will put things between pages and give them a label, a message, and a date just to be reminded of something that happened, either with that plant or, you know, at a particular date. And sometimes these persons, in the case of a flower, they will let it dry or turn brown, and then they will just place it in a book and flatten it. That's what the word press there means, okay? And they become pages of memory, because when the person's literally speaking, from time to time, when they visit that book, just like an actual photo in an album, when you see a photo, you would have traveled somewhere some years ago, you will remember, oh, this was about this something, oh, this was graduation. Okay, so that's what we mean by pages of memory, a book where you keep items that reminds you of a particular event or experience in the past. Okay, so now pages of memory is an example of a metaphor, but we'll get there. Let's examine the visual imagery in stanza 8. So visual imagery, the first example we have there is full-blown blossoms, because we can, you know, visualize flowers or petals when they are full blown. We can see the difference between when they are young, when they are wilt, and, you know, when they are freshly open or developed. And the word press there is an example of visual imagery, because the person says that I think I'll pluck the full-blown blooms and press them. You can visualize the person actually placing or preserving the petals of the orchids in their dry state between pages of memory. Okay, they are pressed there. They are placed between a book. They have been flattened there for future reference, whether it's to draw in inspiration or to be, you know, just remind the person of what transpired that day. Okay, and I said to you that a metaphor is actually pages of memory. Literally, it's the actual book I explained, where a person allow flowers to dry, or maybe not allow them to dry, but in this case, you will realize as we go on to stanza 9 and 10 that the person will dry them and place them between these pages. and they are called pages of memory. But sometimes, metaphorically speaking, pages of memory refers to your brain, because you know that we use our brain to what? Store information, right? That's our memory box. That's where we store things. Our pages, our book cover, everything is there. Figurative speaking. Okay, so page of memory refers to the experience that the person that occurs with the orchid on this particular day that has been stored in the persona's mind. Okay, pages of memory could be the different messages that we find in poems or poetry sometimes about some story or an event that occurred in the past as well. Okay, there's also an example of alliteration, which is full-blown bloom. What is being alliterated there is the letter B in blown and blooms there. So it's just basically alliterating or repeating the idea, or just giving us that imagery of how beautiful and well developed the petals or the blooms were that particular morning. Of course, I told you that diction is a poetic device. Where we think about diction, diction is the persona's choice of words. Okay, the words used in order to convey or to enhance our understanding of the poem or the situation of what is being studied at the moment. Now, stanza 9 and 10 says, perhaps in their thin, dry transparency, I'll discover their peculiar poetry. So after all of that, the person said, perhaps there's a message here, just perhaps, let me think about it. And I think I need more time, even in the future, to think about this peculiar message here that this particular orchid or flower, this particular experience has for me. The person says, perhaps in their thin, dry transparency. In their thin, dry transparency. Literally, it means after the orchid, after having been plucked, after they would have turned brown, okay, after they would have died. This is an example of a euphemism, okay? A euphemism is a word or phrase used instead of a harsh, impolite, or unpleasant word, okay? So, for example, in the case of when, somebody dies, you don't say, oh, I heard that your father died. Persons tend to use words like passed away, or he's sleeping, or he or she is sleeping, just so that they wouldn't create any sadness or store any sadness in that person, right? I'm not saying that it's only used with death. But when a euphemism is used, it's just the person just using a word that is harsh, okay? So in this case, the person notices that the person is not saying perhaps in their death. The person says what? Perhaps in their thin, dry transparency. They are thin because they have been dried out. And transparency, that is the extent to which these particular orchids or plants or nature will get after we would have plucked them, okay? So the person is saying that perhaps in their death, I'll discover their peculiar poetry. Perhaps in their death, I will discover their meaning. I will discover the lesson that they really want to teach me. That's basically what the person is saying in these two lines, okay? So let's discuss the poetic devices to see how they can further enhance our understanding of stanza 9 or 10. So of course we have visual imagery because it appeals to our sense of sight. We can visualize the orchids becoming dry and very thin over time because after dying, these plants, they tend to change color. In this case, most likely they will change to a darker color, even brown, okay? And even transparency tells us that in their thin, dry transparency, where I could see through them, where they are no longer thick with probably liquid and so on, I'll be able to probably learn a particular lesson. I told you about the euphemism. The persona, knowing that he or she has to pluck the flowers to place them between pages of memory, the person refuses to use words like death, perhaps to soften the blow, or for the reader to even think about, oh my God, after being taught this particular lesson, you're going to pluck it, you're going to kill the flower, just let it, let it strive a bit, right? But it seems easier to say words like dried, meaning death, okay? And sometimes I like to say that it's a paradox, right? A paradox is a figurative device where in some truth or in a false statement lies a truth, okay? So in the case of the orchid, the person recognizes, well, for the person that, what is really in depth, I will understand their peculiar poetry. I will understand their further meaning. I will understand further lessons, right? That's for the person. It is in depth. This is really ironic because we really expect when somebody is alive, when somebody is there, that's the time you should cherish them. That's the time you should learn the lessons that they have for us. There are a lot of persons, they wait until their parents have died, you know, to actually see basically what they were telling them about in terms of how they behave, things that they should do or shouldn't do. Sometimes it's in that some persons actually come to terms about a lot of their wrongs and their rights, you know, to actually turn around their life and become a better person, right? Sometimes too, it takes, when we talk about paradox, sometimes it takes death, which really should not be the case, for persons to really learn a lesson. And really and truly, that should not be the case, right? But sometimes the opposite of what is expected happens. So when we consider the metaphor, peculiar poetry is another way of talking about literally flowers' strange and unique quality and appeal. Okay? Metaphorically, it can mean lesson, right? It can mean its appeal. It can mean the experience that I actually witnessed here today. There's a message here that I need to look back on when perhaps I'm feeling down, or maybe when I want to feel inspired. Okay? I will go and open this book of memory, whether it's a physical book or the memory inside of my head. Okay? And I have irony there. It is in that the person will feel able to study the flowers and understand their strange and peculiar meaning and appeal. Okay? And I sometimes tell students when I get to this point, perhaps in their thin, dry transparency. So we are saying that thin, dry transparency is a euphemism for that. Sometimes I tend to tell students, you know, sometimes you're in school and we give you all work. Your parents just tell you, you know what, sometimes you don't even have to do anything in the house. You don't have to pay a bill. You don't have to do, you know, a lot of things. There's some household where parents will allocate chores and so on. Sometimes when we are at that age, that tender teenage, that we take it for granted. It's only when that time would have ended, right? And we are now adult paying bills, paying mortgages, that we look back and really realize that having debt in terms of having that particular period of our life, having it being ended, we realize that, you know, we took those times for granted. Okay? Okay, so we have come to the end of our analysis. Let's examine the themes in the poem. We have examples of death, conflicts and complications, people and desires, nature, poetry, and survival. Okay? And the example of that in the poem is seen when the persona says what? That he or she, well, ideas of death. I was certain that they would wilt, and having been wilt, I will actually place them in this week's garbage. Okay, but we saw that the flowers actually defile death. Conflicts and complication, we see the conflict between the flower and the persona, right? And the complication in terms of just when the persona saw, or the person thought that he or she had won in terms of the flower dying, the tables actually turned, right? Where the flower actually bloomed, it actually survived. People and desire, right? We see the desire of the persona to actually throw the flowers away, right? We also saw the desire of the persona to plot them between, to press them between pages of memory for future study, for future inspiration. And of course, nature. The flower is a part of nature, right? And nature has a way of actually drawing our attention. In the case of the orchids, we saw that nature, even though this particular orchid or flower had no fragrance, its vibrant hue, purple hue, actually drew the person's attention. And it further drew its attention by the way in which it defiled death. Having been watered once, the orchid still prevailed, okay? And it actually demonstrated the quality of bravery, which even made the poet, makes the poet suggest that really and truly this orchid is deserving of a Purple Heart, that medal that is given to soldiers in the army. And of course, we saw poetry where the orchid was the blossoms or the petals of the orchid, when it actually blossomed in that particular morning, actually is being compared to poetry. Right? A poem that is well written and well crafted, right, will always be remembered. So the quality of a poem that is well written was used to describe the way in which the petals looked, having been revitalized that morning, that very morning when the person was going to throw it away. And of course, we saw survival. The orchid actually defiled death, midlife challenges. the persona saw that that nature survived regardless of humans' attempt to destroy it. And there are different examples of tone. When we talk about tone in poetry, we are talking about the persona's attitude towards the subject. Okay, so in this case, it's the persona in the poem attitude towards the orchid. So at one point, the persona was disinterested. When somebody is disinterested, they're having or feeling no interest in something, right? And so we saw that when the persona was given the orchid and they were just there, you know, just watered once, and the person didn't care about them. If anything, the person only hoped that the orchids will be a part of that week's litter or garbage. Okay, then we see the tone being changed to even appreciation, right? Having witnessed and witnessed that the orchid actually survived being watered once, right? The person has come to appreciate the orchid more. I tend to tell students at this point that there are a lot of times when students or persons generally, when we are given a poem sometimes, there are some persons who have the ability to just read words and understand or know the gist of the poem or a piece of writing at the beginning, but sometimes it takes time, right? Writing and reading, especially poetry, when you would have dissect the poem line by line and analysis, when you get to the end of the poem, using and understanding the poetic devices, you tend to develop that appreciation for the poem. Likewise, this is what happened to the person in this poem. Okay, having experienced what the both of them experienced and realizing that, wait, there's something here in this orchid that I should preserve. Without a doubt, we saw that the persona actually developed a sense of appreciation for the orchid, so much so that he or she placed them between pages of memory, whether it's the literal or the physical book, at least in one of those pages of memory, and also the persona's brain. Okay, that particular experience. The tone actually changed to annoyance when the person says, I watered them once. Even the person said, not just that, but the person said, I starved them. They will not die. It suggests that the person is really annoyed. Okay, he or she is annoyed because, of course, he or she is not having their way. It seems as though the orchid is actually defiling them. Okay, and we saw curiosity when the person said, perhaps I think that I will actually preserve them and so on. So the person is now curious, there's really something here about this orchid, okay? And the person is at times at the beginning even unimpressed by even the person, this compulsive person who just give flowers for any reason whatsoever, right? And we see that the person is intrigued when the person says in that line, but this morning the stalks tipped unfurled. The person, of course, really intrigued. He or she is surprised by what actually happened. Uncertainty is also seen where the person said that I was sure that I will toss them out in this week's garbage. Okay? And surprise is seen in that. Even that line, when all of a sudden that morning the flowers just open up like one big fresh flowers as if it was attached to water or sunlight. And the poem in itself and the person is reflective. The person is thinking deeply about what is happening there. The persona is thinking so deeply that he or she wishes to do so further in the future, which led the person to actually take the orchid and place them between pages of memory. Okay? And the mood, when we talk about the mood of the poem, the mood really refers to, in this case, the reader or the listener, the way in which the poet's use of words, how it made you feel. Okay? For example, when the person start talking about this morning, the petals or the stalk tip unfurled, right? It makes you want to think about it. Even after the person was saying, sharing with us that I'm going to place them between pages of memory, and perhaps there's a meaning here, right? It actually allows the reader to think deeply for him or herself about what has transpired. What have I learned? What in my life that I am not appreciating? What in my life that I have taken for granted? Okay, and of course, the reader will develops a sense of appreciation for nature, over some aspects of life generally. Okay, and of course, the reader, there's a difference between pensive and reflective. Okay. When we are reflective, we are pondering especially about some time in the past. You know, this poem actually pushes us or forces us to think about that time in our past when we didn't appreciate something. And we actually only when it would have gone, that's when we develop appreciation. Like the person says what, that perhaps in their death, the person waits until the person's death to actually learn. Okay, and we tend to, just listening to that, we will tend to think about a moment to see if we had, or we can actually think like the person in that moment. And when we talk about pensive, when you are pensive, you look thoughtful, right? Especially from sadness. So it's not that we are actually sad. There are times, well, at least for me, while I was reading the poem, especially first time, and even every time I read the poem, why is it about this particular orchid? I understand that they were given without any value attached, because the person just give them because it's Sunday or whatever reason, unmentioned reason, may I add, right? That the person wanted to kill them. I wanted to starve them. That determination to kill something. For me, I would have felt some feeling of sadness, very, very small feeling. Okay, but it too allowed me to actually go into pensive thought. Okay, as I reflect on my life about where I would have taken something or someone for granted as well. Okay, so here's a summary of the poem. The person prepares to move out of a house by placing his or her belongings in a box. However, a spray of orchids given by a compulsive person remains unboxed. The flowers' odorless quality and beauty cause the persona to water them once, hoping they will die soon. However, the flower survived and bloomed. The persona preserves the flowers, dried petals, in a book in order to study and understand their appeal in the future. Thank you for listening. We have come to the end of my analysis. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And until we meet again, bye.